Okay, so my second presentation, part two of the doubleheader, is an update on twinBASIC. This is the third year now that I've presented twinBASIC at DevCon Vienna. 2 years ago was actually the global launch of the product from Wayne Phillips, who is the creator of VB Watchdog, VB Mappy. I think he's a few other projects, different access products. Anyway, so what I wanted to do here is just talk about what some of the potential future plans are for potential integrations between twinBASIC and Access. So here's what we're going to cover. I'll do a brief overview of twinBASIC. Keep it pretty brief because I'm sure we've got a lot of people that have been here before, but probably a few who don't know anything about the project. We'll do a progress update on where it's at, take a look at the current roadmap. I've got a couple demonstrations to show, and then we'll finish up with Access integration plans, which are probably still about 6 months to a year out, at least, but some exciting possibilities looking ahead. So what is twinBASIC? It's a fully compiled language. It's built to be 100% backwards compatible with VBA and VB6. So the initial target market would be those VB6 developers that are still maintaining applications, and there are still some that are out there. As most of you know, when Microsoft abandoned VB6 in favor of VB.NET, while the two languages shared a similar syntax, there are a lot of differences under the covers between those two. And so migrating from VB6 to VB.NET, there were some automated tools that would get you part of the way, but there was no way to just do a complete lift and shift and drop it in. One of the goals for twinBASIC is to be able to do that, to be able to open up a Visual Basic project file and just compile it and have it work in twinBASIC. So that's one of the reasons that's important now too, is that VB6 is only 32-bit. So VBA 7 introduced 64-bit support. The 64-bit support never got made available to Visual Basic, classic Visual Basic. So that's why it's stuck on VB6. So along with that compatibility, there's also a bunch of new language features. I've demonstrated these before. If you go back or on the page, the web page that I've got for today's presentation, I've got links to videos the last two videos I've done where I dive into some of these language features a little bit more. Okay, so let's do a quick progress update. Pure code is, I would say, roughly 99.9% complete. So as far as all the stuff that if you don't have any kind of user interface code, anything that you've written in VB6, for the most part, comes over, and there's some pretty extensive projects that have already been ported over, and I'll show that in one of my slides later. Some of the sample work that's been done out there. Forms, the user interface, the GUI, I would say is about 95% complete right now. There are some missing properties still that need to be implemented, and Wayne maintains a list of what those are. So there's some members of the app object, different control members, and there's links to the GitHub issues that go with those that you'll be able to get when I make the slide deck available later. And one of the other things that is left to do before a version 1 release is to create enable optimized builds via LLVM, which is sort of a programming language agnostic tool that can optimize compiled code. Right now, as far as I know, and it's been in a couple months or a few weeks since this was updated, so this may have changed, but currently the official tentative release date is July 3rd of this year for version 1. And again, version 1 is really focused on that Visual Basic 6 100% compatibility. And then once that's out the door, then some of the really exciting features can start to show up. So here's the roadmap highlights. The rest of this quarter, I think Wayne is focused on doing those optimized builds, getting to a version 1.0 release. In quarter 3, there's some other things, but the highlights are VB Watchdog, adding inheritance, full inheritance, multi-threading, which is the language is already multi-threaded. There's just no syntax to really make use of it at this point. So adding the native syntax to do multi-threading, and then cross-platform support for Linux and Mac, to work on other desktops. For quarter 4, there's edit and continue, which is that feature when you're debugging code in VBA that you can hit a breakpoint and then you can make changes to your code and then step through it and make changes and step through it without having to start over again. I didn't realize until I started working in other languages that that's pretty unique to VBA, and that's a really powerful tool to have. So that'll be nice to see that. Cross-platform support for Android, and then Wayne has a technique that is going to allow for 32-bit ActiveX controls to be used in 64-bit twinBASIC, and I believe 64-bit VBA. I don't know if Wayne's in the chat and he can fact check me on that, because as I look at that now, I don't remember whether that's just for twinBASIC use or if you're going to be able to port 32-bit ActiveX controls to VBA. And I think ultimately you would be able to, because if you can add them as ActiveX controls in twinBASIC, then you can create ActiveX controls in twinBASIC that can be used in VBA. So, ultimately there's going to be a path there. And again, you've got a lot of ActiveX controls that were built in the early 2000s and the late 90s that were built in VB6 and are only available as 32-bit controls, and so they won't run on 64-bit VBA. It looks like there could be a path forward to take some of those existing controls and wrap them and have them usable in 64-bit VBA. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some sample projects that are out there. By far the most active person in the twinBASIC community with this is a guy named, who goes by Fafalone. I believe that it might be John Johnson, maybe is his actual name, but there's a couple links in here, and again, you'll have access to the slide deck. Some of these are only available in twinBASIC currently, but some of them can be used in VBA. We started testing some of them within Access, and we can get them added to the form, and we could do some stuff with them, but we're still running into some bugs. Don't know if that was on our end or if that was some limitations of what the controls can do in VBA at this point, because I know there are some obstacles there. Ben Clothier, another Access MVP, has a project on GitHub that basically takes twinBASIC and it's making a non-automation COM library compatible with VBA. So as much as it's about making 7-zip, which is a compression utility available in VBA, it's also about proving the concept of being able to take a library that doesn't support automation. So you can't use create object in VBA, in Access. You can't get to it directly, and converting it so that you can use it within VBA. And then these last three that I'm going to demonstrate here briefly are projects that I have my high school intern, Jonah Legg. He has been developing these over the last few months, and with very little, embarrassingly little direction from me. You know, he would come in after school, and I'd kind of tell him what I wanted it to do, but wasn't able to sit down and really take the time to sort of walk him through it. So just I bring that up to point out how far somebody that's relatively new to programming, he's never taken any actual computer science programming classes, what he was able to accomplish with twinBASIC, and just a little bit of direction. So let me switch now to that. Okay, now can't really move that. Okay, so there we go. Okay, everybody can see the code window now?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so this module explorer code, first, this is a tool window that he added in here, and what it's doing is this is a replacement for the project explorer, so that it just replaces the existing tree view, which is limited to just those 3 nodes, and then it does some things like based on naming convention, but there are options where you can change this around to group things. So, you know, all the interfaces show up here, different with events classes, you know, other class modules that start with CLS app, and so that pops in here. One of the controls that's not available quite yet is, or at least it wasn't when he was working on this, it might be available now, is a tab control. But I wanted to have basically code pane tabs so that I could switch between different code modules. And so I gave him the idea of using a button and a fixed width font. And so he wrote some pretty, really pretty impressive code, especially from his limited background, that goes through and takes all the open windows and it puts them on a button. And then as you, depending on where you click on the button, it loads that window. So those are the first two, the module explorer and the code pane tabs. But the one that I'm most excited about, I think, is this what we're calling Mentor, and it's basically GitHub Copilot, but for VBA. And so it's still pretty early on in kind of the proof of concept phase. But for instance, you can do things like copying some code, pasting it in here, and just telling it to explain that code. And what it's doing is it's doing an API call, and it's not using ChatGPT, but it's an AI API that's specifically for code use, and it's going out and it's getting that. So, you know, that's the first thing. And you can type in, you know, whatever code you want here. Just tell it to explain that code, and it'll tell you what it does. Eventually, what we'd like to do is, so this this function here concatenates 2 different text strings, and I've written an article about this. But what he's added here is we can comment everything in this code module. So I've got the code module, so it's only got a single function in there just to speed things up. But what it does is it generates documentation automatically. So it's taking this function here, it's sending it out to the AI API, and it's using a customizable format that you can specify for what you want your comment to look like. So if I wanted to use a different format, these are some of the base formats that he put in there. So if I come in here, there's an option in there to comment out the entire project, but anyway, so there's a lot of potential uses here, and again, the AI part of this is not anything specific to twinBASIC, but what twinBASIC does is it allows you to create these kinds of tool windows relatively easily, especially using a language that we're already familiar with. And I have in the links that I'm going to show, I do have some samples for how to create these kinds of tool windows in VBA. Okay. All right, so let's go into the Access integration plans. So there are some challenges for integrating with Access versus VB6. So one key difference is that Access is still under active development. Even though it might not always look like it, it is still technically under active development versus VB6, which has been dead for years and is kind of frozen in time. Also, the Access object model. So the VBA has a standard library that's relatively small. The Access object model is huge. It's vast, and it includes all kinds of stuff like user level security. Even though it's not supported in newer versions of Access, it's still part of the object model and still would need to be implemented to provide backward compatibility. And then also there's the Jet/ACE expression service. So this is how you can call code from within like every control or every event handler on a form. It runs through the expression service, which is kind of its own separate beast. So I talked to Wayne a few weeks ago about whether he had plans to replace the VB development environment itself. And he said if I had asked him last year, the answer would have been a resounding yes. But over the last year, he's adjusted that a little bit. One, there's some legal considerations because VBA is an actively developed project. Microsoft might be a little more willing to quicker to see that as an infringement on what they're currently doing versus VB6, which is they're no longer actively selling it or using it. And then the other thing is that Rubber Duck, the Rubber Duck VBA project, which is spearheaded by former Access MVP Matthew Gwindon, they're working on a version 3, which is actually looking at putting in a replacement for the VB development environment. So Wayne kind of, he doesn't want to step on their toes and wants to kind of take a wait and see approach. So that's what's kind of on the horizon. But the Rubber Duck version 3 project is something to keep an eye on, just as Access developers. So what are some of the things that he might be doing? One of them is advanced linked tables. So within twinBASIC, you would be able to create normal linked tables the way that you do now for ODBC support for SQL Server, for MySQL, Postgres, all those kinds of things. But he also wants to have the ability for you to write custom data providers using classes in twinBASIC that presumably would implement some interface. And so you would be able to do things like grab data off the web, and you could fetch that data, do some transformation to it, and then make it available as a linked table. So you could use it like a linked table. This is the kind of stuff that is actually going on behind the scenes anyway within Access. If you've ever looked at how Access integrates with SQL Server, it's not what you would expect. So part of what Wayne wants to do is kind of expose that and make that available to people. So you could do things like create a QuickBooks Online connector. And then one of the key things to remember with this is that not every user would have to do this. A couple of advanced users could provide these things through a package manager. he would be supporting migration of forms and reports, including data binding, so bound forms would work. And he would also be creating equivalent cross-platform access controls. So every text box, combo box, all those things would be re-implemented in twinBASIC. So what he's looking at is the community to play a role at some point, because that access object model is so large. So what Wayne would be providing within twinBASIC would be link tables, data binding, equivalent controls, implementing the expression service, and form and report migration. And then he would want to lean on the community to provide implementation of the access object model, potentially custom data providers, custom controls, like maybe a scheduling control, so you could do an Outlook style calendar, and distribute those via a package manager, which is, I don't want to step on Kevin's and Carl's toes, but that's something that they're going to be talking about later today or tomorrow on the VBA side, is can we get some kind of a package manager like a NuGet in VBA? So I just checked yesterday. It looks like the licensing hasn't changed from this time last year. It is done on a subscription basis, but the community version does have a lot of capability. And if you're willing to look at a 5-second splash screen, you can do an awful lot with the community edition. You can certainly make sure that it's going to do what you need, and then step up to a professional or an ultimate license if you're going to use it professionally, and you want to get that better performance. You want to get rid of the splash screen and that kind of thing. And commercial use, royalty-free license for all editions. So even if you're using the community edition, you can still use it in commercial projects. And
Mike, you've got about 4 minutes left.
With that, thank you, Philip. That brings me to the final question slide. So I will take any questions on twinBASIC, or if you've got any questions that came up on the original topic, defensive programming, I'll happily take those now.
So there are no questions in the chat, at least no major ones that we can address.
Okay, so what I'll just show real quick. Like I said, I've got this is the web page for today's presentation. So you can just go right to nolongerset.com, and both presentations are listed here now. So there's a whole bunch of links if you want to install twinBASIC and just poke around, play around with it a little bit. I've got instructions for installing the development environment, where you can go to get information. The Discord server is actually a little bit more active these days than the GitHub issue tracker. Here's a link to the roadmap, and then past videos from, again, if you're not familiar with the project at all, this video from 2021 is a good introduction to some of the new syntax and some of the new features that were added to twinBASIC. Last year, I went in and did several live demos of creating COM add-ins that could be used in across the entire Office suite. So you could use it in Excel, Word, Access, and then also creating those tool windows like I demonstrated that you could use in the VBA development environment.
We got two questions coming in.
Okay.
The first one is from Ben, and he asks, without data binding, it sounds like twinBASIC from development is more like developing in Excel VBA rather than Access. Is that true?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, at this point, I talked to Wayne about it, and he said twinBASIC really isn't at the point where it makes sense for Access developers to try and really migrate anything over. Where I see, as of April 2023, still the biggest advantage is being able to create tools for yourself in the development environment and create COM add-ins that you can use and make them available across multiple applications or across multiple Excel files. You can add things to the ribbon in Excel. So Yeah, until there's data binding, there's really not a lot of compelling use cases for moving existing code from Access into twinBASIC at this point.
Okay. Another question, Klaus asks, integration with VS Code? That is the question already, but maybe you can comment on that.
Sure, yeah. So for those that have been following along for a while, the original development environment was VS Code. That was what you had to use to develop in it. And that worked really well until Wayne got into the form design part. And then just started running into limitations of VS Code as a development environment, because it's meant to be a lightweight development environment that's really focused around text. And so Wayne was able to do some pretty clever things to kind of get it to work for GUI form design, drag and drop, but ultimately just kept running into different limitations and constraints within VS Code. So last I knew, and it's been probably 6 months or more since it's come up, there are still long-term plans to provide support for VS Code, but right now I think it is still technically supported, but it's several versions back now. I think if you wanted to upload things into the package manager, I think that still has to get done through VS Code. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we should come to an end here. There are no more questions in the chat. At least no more that can be quickly answered, I think.
All right. I should be around as well for the session later. So if you have any questions throughout the day, you want to jot them down, we can cover those in the recap.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation.
All right, thanks.